The millionaire bride pointed to the pregnant maid in the corner. For our next song, she announced to hundreds of guests, she will give us a special performance. Forced onto the stage and trapped, she had no idea this public humiliation was about to become her boss's ultimate ruin. But before we dive into the full, shocking story, welcome to our channel. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is down in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And while you're there, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a moment of the drama. Now let's get started. The scent of industrial-grade lemon polish did little to mask the sterile emptiness of the hallway. Sunlight, sliced into perfect, dustless beams by floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminated the cold Italian marble under Clara Vance's worn-out sneakers. At 6 months pregnant, every movement felt deliberate, a conscious negotiation between her aching back and the gentle, insistent kicks of the tiny life nestled beneath her heart. Her world had shrunk to this opulent cage, a sprawling Bel Air mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. Each priceless vase she dusted, each pristine surface she wiped, was a monument to a life that wasn't hers. A life that never would be. Her own life, the one filled with the warm clutter of a tiny Nashville apartment and the sound of a beat-up acoustic guitar, had ended 5 months ago on a rain-slicked stretch of highway. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, ambushed her as she polished a chrome sculpture. Leo, his face alight with a joy so pure it seemed to radiate its own warmth, holding up the positive pregnancy test like a winning lottery ticket. "We're going to have a little harmony, Clara," he'd whispered, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. His calloused fingers, so adept at coaxing melodies from 6 strings, had felt like a promise of safety, of a future scored with love songs and lullabies. One of those lullabies, a simple, nameless tune he'd been composing for their baby, was the last thing he had hummed before leaving for his weekly gig. He never came home. Now that broken lullaby was a secret she carried, a ghost of a melody for a child who would never know her father's touch. It was the only piece of him she had left, and she guarded it fiercely. "Try to be so visible today, Clara," a voice like chilled champagne cut through her thoughts. Clara straightened slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. Serafina Dubois stood at the end of the hall, a vision in white linen, her posture as severe and flawless as the architecture surrounding them. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over Clara without truly seeing her, her gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on Clara's swollen abdomen with an expression that bordered on disgust. Serafina viewed the staff not as people, but as minor imperfections in her otherwise curated world, and a pregnant maid was the most visible imperfection of all. "Yes, Miss Dubois," Clara murmured, lowering her eyes and stepping back, making herself smaller. Serafina glided past without another word, leaving a trail of expensive, cloying perfume in her wake. A moment later, Julian Thorne, her fiancé and the master of the house, strode down the same hall. He paused, offering Clara a brief, distracted smile. He was a man perpetually lost in the digital glow of his phone, his mind on algorithms and stock prices, but there was a fundamental decency to him that Serafina lacked. "Everything all right, Clara?" he asked, his thumb still scrolling. "You're not overdoing it, are you?" "I'm fine, Mr. Thorne. Thank you." He nodded, already moving on. "Good. Big day tomorrow. Pre-wedding charity gala. Serafina is tense." He offered it as both an explanation and an apology before disappearing into his home office. He was kind, but his kindness was a distant star, visible but offering no real warmth. He didn't see the undercurrent of his fiancée's cruelty, and Clara knew better than to point it out. Her survival here depended on her invisibility. Her duties for the day ended in the East Wing, in a suite filled with faded photographs and the scent of lavender and old books. This was Eleanor's room. Julian's grandmother was a woman adrift in the fog of dementia, her days a chaotic jumble of past and present. Today was a bad day. A nurse hovered near the door as Eleanor, frail and bird-like in her armchair, grew increasingly agitated, her hands twisting the fabric of her quilt. "It's gone, it's all gone," she muttered, her eyes wide with a fear only she understood. The nurse gave Clara a helpless look. Clara simply nodded, pulled up a small footstool and sat beside the old woman's chair. She didn't speak. She just began to hum, the melody soft and tentative at first. It was Leo's song. The broken lullaby. As the notes filled the quiet room, a remarkable change came over Eleanor. Her frantic movements stilled. Her breathing deepened, evening out. She turned her head, her clouded blue eyes finding Clara's. When the world feels too loud and the light feels too bright, close your eyes, little love, and hold on through the night. Clara's voice wasn't a performance. It was a whisper, a thread of spun honey and sorrow. She sang of finding your way home in the dark, of a love that waits just beyond the sunrise. The words were new, ones she'd been writing in her head during the long, lonely nights, but the melody was all Leo. With every note, she poured her own grief, her own yearning for a safe harbor into the song. Eleanor's hand, wrinkled and spotted with age, reached out and found Clara's. Her grip was surprisingly firm. A flicker of recognition, of peace, settled in her gaze. She wasn't just listening to a song. She was being tethered to the present by the pure, unvarnished emotion in Clara's voice. For these few precious minutes, the fog in her mind cleared, and she was simply an old woman being comforted. Clara sang the last verse, her voice thick with unshed tears. For her, she wasn't just singing to Eleanor. She was singing to the baby inside her, making a promise that even though their world had been shattered, she would find a way to piece it back together. This room, this bond with a woman lost in time, was the only place she felt seen, the only place her broken heart could offer something whole. It was the only warmth in her cold, new reality, a fragile piece she couldn't have known was about to become the catalyst for a storm. The jealousy took root a few days later. Serafina stood in the archway of the main living room, a flute of champagne in her hand, watching as Julian returned from his grandmother's suite. He had a rare, unguarded smile on his face, the kind she hadn't been able to coax out of him in weeks of stressful wedding planning. "Grandmother had a good day," he said, his eyes still distant with the memory. Clara was with her. She was singing. It's remarkable. It's the only thing that truly reaches her. He looked at Serafina then, but his gaze seemed to pass right through her. "That girl is a godsend. A godsend." The words landed like shards of ice in Serafina's champagne. A pregnant maid, a nobody, was being lauded as a savior while she, the future Mrs. Thorne, was treated like a high-strung event planner. She watched Clara emerge from the East Wing minutes later, looking tired but serene, and the quiet dignity of the other woman was an intolerable affront. The bond Clara had forged with Eleanor wasn't just a kindness, it was a usurpation. It was a role that should have been hers. An idea, cold and sharp, began to form. She needed to prove that anything the maid could do, she could do better. The next afternoon, Serafina orchestrated her opportunity with chilling precision. "Clara," she called, her tone deceptively pleasant. "The crystal in the main dining room needs a full inventory and polish before tomorrow's gala. Every single piece. I don't want to see a single smudge." It was a tedious, painstaking task that would keep Clara occupied for hours, far from the East Wing. Once Clara was safely tucked away, Serafina made her move. She glided down the hallway to Eleanor's suite, her posture perfect, her smile a carefully constructed mask of warmth. She found the old woman sitting by the window, humming tunelessly to herself. The nurse was on her break. They were alone. "Eleanor, dear," Serafina began, her voice a soft, practiced coo. "How are you feeling today? I thought I might sing for you. A little something to brighten the afternoon." Eleanor looked at her with vacant eyes, offering no protest. Taking this as an invitation, Serafina sat gracefully in the chair Clara usually occupied. She took a delicate breath and began to sing. Her choice was a classic, "Hush, Little Baby," a song she had performed flawlessly at a charity benefit once. Her pitch was perfect, her diction immaculate. Each note was a chiseled, polished stone, dropped precisely into the silence of the room. But it was a performance, not a comfort. Her voice was a beautiful, empty vessel, devoid of the raw, aching soul that flowed so effortlessly from Clara. At first, Eleanor just seemed confused. She tilted her head, a frown creasing her brow. Then, as Serafina launched into the second verse, her perfect voice filling the room with its hollow perfection, Eleanor's confusion curdled into distress. Her hands fluttered to her ears as if to block out an unpleasant noise. She began to rock back and forth, her breathing growing ragged. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. Serafina faltered for a half-second, annoyed at the interruption, before continuing, her voice a fraction louder. "No." Eleanor's voice was suddenly sharp, shockingly lucid. She pushed herself back in her chair, her eyes blazing with a clarity that cut right through Serafina's composure. "You're wrong. You're not her." She pointed a trembling finger at the door. "I want the other girl. The one with the sad songs. Leave." The command was absolute. The rejection total. In the silent, sunlit room with no one to witness it, Serafina's ego suffered a fatal blow. For a moment she just sat there, frozen, the last note of the lullaby dying on her lips. Then a dark flush crept up her neck, staining her pale skin. Her practiced smile tightened into a bloodless, razor-thin line. She stood without a word, her movements stiff and robotic. She walked out of the room, closing the door with a quiet, deliberate click. As she strode down the empty hallway, her graceful glide was gone, replaced by a furious, rigid march. The mask had not just cracked, it had been shattered. And in its place was a cold, simmering fury. Clara Vance was no longer just an insignificant annoyance. She was an enemy. An enemy who had made her feel small, and for that she would have to be publicly and permanently destroyed. In the wake of her private humiliation, the atmosphere in the mansion curdled. Serafina's disdain for Clara, once a passive, cold indifference, sharpened into a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. Life became a series of carefully laid traps. One morning, Serafina ran a gloved finger along a windowsill Clara had polished just minutes before, producing an imaginary speck of dust. "Sloppy," she declared, her voice loud enough for other staff to hear. "Perhaps the pregnancy is affecting your attention to detail." The cruelty was relentless and targeted. While other maids were assigned to arrange flowers or set tables for the upcoming gala, Serafina tasked Clara with scrubbing the expansive flagstone patio on her hands and knees. "The fresh air will do you good," she'd said, the smile never reaching her eyes. Another day it was carrying heavy baskets of laundry up 3 flights of stairs because the service elevator was, mysteriously, out of order. Clara endured it all with a quiet, steely resolve. Every insult she swallowed, every ache in her back was fuel. It was money for a crib, for diapers, for a future that depended solely on her. Her only respite came in the hushed afternoons with Eleanor. The old woman's quiet companionship and the shared solace of Leo's songs were a shield against the mansion's creeping hostility, a reminder that kindness still existed in the world. The catalyst arrived 2 days before the wedding, shattering the tense calm. Aubrey, the impeccably organized wedding planner, burst into the main hall, her face ashen, her phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. "She's cancelled," Aubrey announced to Serafina and Julian, who were reviewing seating charts. "Jasmine Vance. Her doctor just called. Acute laryngitis. She can't even speak, let alone sing." Genuine panic flared in Aubrey's eyes. Julian ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "Cancelled? The singer we're paying a fortune for? 2 days before the wedding? This is a catastrophe." Aubrey lamented, already scrolling through her contacts. "I can try my backup list, but a singer of Jasmine's caliber on this short notice? It's impossible." Serafina, however, remained unervingly calm. She placed a hand on Julian's arm, a perfect portrait of a supportive fiancé in a crisis. "Darling, don't worry," she said, her voice smooth as silk. But behind her eyes, a predatory glint flickered to life. This wasn't a disaster, it was an opportunity. "What about a recording?" Julian suggested, ever the pragmatist. "We have her studio version of the song. It's not ideal, but it's a solution." "A recording?" Serafina scoffed, feigning offense. "Julian, this is our first dance. It's a moment we'll remember for the rest of our lives. It has to be live. It has to be perfect." "I have a few other artists I can call," Aubrey insisted, her voice tight with stress. "There's a wonderful jazz singer who performs at the Bel Air Hotel, or a classical soprano who—" "No," Serafina cut her off, her tone leaving no room for argument. "No one we don't know. No one who isn't right for the aesthetic of the evening." She dismissed every one of Aubrey's frantic logical suggestions with a wave of her hand. She was not solving the problem. She was creating a vacuum, a space of manufactured desperation that only one person could be forced to fill. Julian, overwhelmed by the logistics and wanting only to placate his increasingly theatrical fiancée, finally relented. All right. Do what you think is best, Serafina. Just fix it." He trusted her to handle it, completely oblivious to the cruel machinations working behind her concerned facade. With Julian's unwitting permission, the trap was set. Serafina's mind raced, the pieces of her vengeful puzzle clicking into place. She needed a stage, a victim, and an audience. She had all three. The perfect, ruinous idea bloomed in her mind, exquisite in its simplicity and its cruelty. Later that evening, Serafina stood on the mezzanine, looking down into the grand dining room below. Clara was on her feet, meticulously polishing the final piece of a vast collection of antique silver, her movements slow and heavy with the fatigue of the day. She was isolated, exhausted, and completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded. She was the perfect target. A slow, venomous smile spread across Serafina's face. She would give Julian his live singer. She would give her guests their unforgettable moment. And she would give the pregnant maid the public humiliation she so richly deserved. It would be flawless. The grand library was the heart of the mansion's silence. It smelled of old leather and paper, a hushed, cathedral-like space where Clara was meant to be invisible. She was on her final task of the night, carefully returning a stack of Julian's research books to their designated shelves, her body screaming for rest. The baby was low and heavy, and each step felt like a monumental effort. She was just sliding the last book into place when a voice, unervingly soft, spoke from the doorway. "Clara, do you have a moment?" Clara turned, her heart giving a nervous jolt. Serafina stood there, silhouetted against the hallway light. She wasn't supposed to be in this part of the house. More unsettling was her expression. The usual mask of cold indifference was gone, replaced by a carefully constructed look of troubled sincerity. She glided into the room, her movements fluid and predatory, and gestured for Clara to sit in one of the imposing leather armchairs opposite the unlit fireplace. It was the first time Serafina had ever invited her to sit. It felt like a trap. "I find myself in a truly awful position," Serafina began, her voice a low, confidential murmur. She perched on the edge of the opposite chair, leaning forward as if sharing a profound secret. "As you may have heard, our wedding singer has cancelled. It's an absolute nightmare." She sighed, a delicate, theatrical sound. "Julian is devastated. He's trying to be strong, of course, but I can see it in his eyes. The first dance was the one moment, the only moment he truly cared about. He wanted it to be perfect." Clara said nothing, her hands folded protectively over her belly. She knew better than to engage. Serafina continued, her gaze intense. "Aubrey has tried everyone. There's simply no one available. And then I thought of you." She let the words hang in the air. "I've heard you singing to Eleanor. So has Julian. You have a gift, Clara. A truly beautiful, soulful voice." The compliment was so unexpected, so contrary to every interaction they'd ever had, that it set off alarms in Clara's head. "Miss Du Bois, that's very kind, but what I do for Mrs. Thorne is different." "Is it?" Serafina pressed, her eyes wide and pleading. "Clara, you could be the one to save the day. Not just the wedding, but Julian's happiness. Imagine the look on his face when he hears your voice fill that room. He would be so incredibly grateful." Clara's refusal was instinctive, a reflex born of grief and self-preservation. "I'm sorry, but I can't. I truly can't." She shook her head, looking down at her hands. "I don't perform publicly anymore. It's been years and I'm not in any state to do something like that." The thought of standing on a stage, of channeling the intimate, sacred act of singing into a public performance, felt like a violation. It was all she had left of Leo, and it was not for them. "I'm a maid here, Miss Du Bois, not an entertainer." The temperature in the room dropped. The mask of sincerity on Serafina's face didn't fall so much as it hardened, her soft features tightening into something sharp and cruel. "I see," she said, her voice losing its feigned warmth. "So this is about you." She leaned back, crossing her legs, the motion slow and deliberate. "Julian takes you in. He gives you a respectable job and a safe place to live when you are pregnant and completely alone. He shows you a kindness most men in his position would never bother with. And on the most important day of his life, when he needs one small thing, your answer is to be selfish." The word, selfish, struck Clara like a slap. It's not like that. Isn't it?" Serafina's voice was now laced with ice. "It would be a terrible shame if your unwillingness to be a team player were seen as a lack of gratitude. A lack of loyalty." She paused, her eyes drifting pointedly to Clara's stomach. In your condition, steady employment and health insurance are so very important, aren't they? It would be a tragedy to lose all that over a simple song. The threat, veiled but unmistakable, hung between them, thick and suffocating. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. Serafina had taken Julian's one act of decency and twisted it into a chain, and now she was pulling it tight. The image of being turned out onto the street, with a baby due in a matter of weeks and nowhere to go, flashed through her mind. All her hard work, all the insults she had swallowed, all the pain she had endured to build this fragile semblance of security, Serafina was threatening to burn it all down with a single word. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow resignation. Her dreams were already dead. Now her dignity was being held for ransom. Serafina's manipulation is infuriating. If you believe no one should be pressured into doing something against their will, hit that like button. Only bullies and manipulators would ignore it. Clara looked up, meeting Serafina's triumphant gaze. Her own felt empty. Just one song, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. A victorious smile bloomed on Serafina's face. Just one. That's all we need. She stood, her mission accomplished. As she turned to leave, she retrieved a sleek, black folder from a nearby table and held it out to Clara. Here. This is the piece Julian chose. It's a beautiful classic. I'm sure a talent like yours will have no trouble with it. Clara's trembling hand took the folder. She opened it. The page was a dizzying cascade of complex notes, arpeggios, and soaring high octaves. It wasn't a classic ballad, it was a technical nightmare, a vocal Everest designed for a professionally trained soprano at the peak of her powers. It was a song chosen not for its beauty, but for its difficulty. It was a song chosen to make her fail. The full, hideous weight of the gilded trap settled upon her, and she realized she hadn't just been asked to sing. She had been sentenced to perform her own execution. The day of the wedding dawned not with quiet anticipation, but with the controlled chaos of a military operation. The mansion was a hive of frantic activity, buzzing with the clipped, urgent tones of florists, caterers, and an army of event staff. The air, thick with the scent of 1,000 white roses and expensive hairspray, vibrated with tension. Clara was a ghost in the machine, relegated to the most menial, background tasks. She polished glasses in a distant service pantry, folded napkins in a stuffy linen closet, and cleared discarded breakfast trays from guest rooms, anything to keep her out of sight, a direct and unspoken order from the bride. Her heart beat a heavy, dread-filled rhythm against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the gentle flutter of her baby. The sheet music Serafina had given her sat folded in the pocket of her uniform, feeling as heavy as a tombstone. She had spent a sleepless night staring at its impossible notes, each one a testament to the cruelty of the woman she worked for. Late in the afternoon, seeking a moment of refuge from the escalating frenzy, Clara slipped into the cavernous kitchen. It was its own whirlwind of clanging pans, hissing steam, and shouted orders, but it felt grounded in a reality far from the artificial perfection of the main house. She was pouring herself a glass of water when a large, warm hand gently touched her arm. It was Matteo, the head chef, his usually jovial face creased with concern. "Come," he said, his voice a low rumble. He guided her into the relative quiet of the walk-in pantry, the cool air a welcome shock. He stood for a moment, looking at her with kind, worried eyes. "Clara, you must be careful tonight." She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I know." "No," he insisted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't understand. This morning I was bringing coffee to the bridal suite. The door was ajar. I heard them." He paused, his expression grim. "Serafina and her bridesmaids. They were talking about you. About your special performance." He practically spat the words. "They were laughing, Clara. Serafina said she couldn't wait to see the little songbird's wings get clipped in front of everyone who matters. One of them asked what would happen if you were actually good. Serafina just smiled and said, 'Don't worry. I chose a song that would make a professional weep.'" A cold dread, sharper and more final than anything she had felt before, washed over Clara. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a confirmed plot, a spectator sport for the cruel and privileged. The kindness in Matteo's eyes made it worse. "Thank you, Matteo," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He squeezed her shoulder once before she slipped back out into the chaos, her fragile hope of a simple, quick embarrassment replaced by the certainty of a calculated execution. An hour before the ceremony, she was clearing empty champagne flutes from a secluded alcove when a wave of dizziness and a sharp pain in her lower back forced her to stop. She leaned against the cool marble wall, closing her eyes and breathing through the discomfort. "Are you all right?" The voice, deep and concerned, startled her. She opened her eyes to see Julian standing a few feet away, looking impeccably handsome in his tuxedo but with a harried, stressed expression. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at her, truly looking, and his brow was furrowed with genuine concern. "You look pale, Clara. Are you sure you're up for this tonight?" Was a lifeline. A fragile, unexpected chance to tell the truth. Her lips parted, the words forming in her throat. "She's forcing me. The song is impossible. It's a trap." "Serafina can be very persuasive," he continued, taking a step closer. "But you don't have to do this. If you're not feeling well, just say the word. I'll handle her." For one fleeting second, Clara believed him. She opened her mouth to speak, to finally confide in the one person who could stop this nightmare. "Julian, darling. There you are." Serafina's voice, sharp and possessive, sliced through the moment. She appeared at the end of the hallway, a breathtaking vision in her couture wedding gown, the yards of silk and lace making her seem both angelic and predatory. She glided toward them, her smile never reaching her eyes. "The photographer is waiting for us," she said, her tone sweet as poison. She threaded her arm through Julian's, her grip possessive, physically turning him away from Clara. As she led him away, she glanced back over her shoulder. The look she gave Clara was one of pure, venomous triumph. It was a silent, chilling promise of the destruction to come. Serafina is doing everything she can to isolate Clara and set her up for failure. We all know someone who thrives on tearing others down. If you can't stand people like Serafina, comment, "Everyone deserves respect," to show you're not on her side. Julian, oblivious, was gone. The lifeline had been cut. Clara was left alone in the echoing silence of the hallway, the weight of her fate pressing down on her with suffocating force. The stage wasn't just a stage anymore. It was a guillotine, and she was walking toward it, utterly and completely alone. The ceremony was a masterpiece of performative elegance. A blur of white roses, hushed vows, and polite, restrained applause. Now the reception was in full swing, a flawless tableau of old money and new tech. The grand ballroom of the Bel Air Country Club shimmered under the weight of a dozen crystal chandeliers. The low hum of expensive chatter, punctuated by the clinking of crystal flutes, filled the air. A jazz ensemble played with languid sophistication from a low stage, their music a smooth, unobtrusive soundtrack for the powerful and the beautiful. Clara moved through it all like a phantom. Her job was to remain on the periphery, a shadow at the edge of the glittering celebration, clearing discarded plates and ensuring water glasses remained full. Every beat of the kick drum felt like a hammer against her ribs. The sheet music in her pocket was a toxic secret, a coiled snake waiting to strike. She kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the intricate patterns of the Persian rugs, trying to breathe through the knot of ice that had taken permanent residence in her stomach. She could feel the occasional curious or pitying glance from a guest who knew the story, but mostly she was invisible. For now. The band finished their set to another wave of polite applause. The MC, a man with a dazzling smile and a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice warming the room. "And now, the moment we've all been waiting for. Would the happy couple, Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, please make their way to the dance floor for their very first dance as husband and wife?" A cheer went through the crowd. Julian, looking slightly uncomfortable but dutiful, began to lead a beaming Serafina toward the center of the room. This was it, the moment of truth. But Serafina stopped. With a grace that was almost reptilian, she glided over to the MC, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "Thank you, Jeffrey," she said, her voice a seductive purr. "But I have a little surprise." She took the microphone from his hand before he could protest. The move was so fluid, so confident, that it seemed entirely natural. A hush fell over the room. 300 guests turned their full attention to the bride. Serafina soaked it in for a moment, her smile radiant, triumphant. She was the sun, and everyone in her orbit was held captive by her gravity. "Thank you all so much for being here to share in our joy," she began, her voice ringing with a false, practiced humility. As some of you know, we had a small last-minute hiccup with our entertainment. But sometimes, the most unexpected moments become the most memorable. She paused, letting the suspense build. We have a last-minute, very special change of plans. She turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the edge of the room until they found their target. Our maid Clara, she said, her voice now laced with a tone of indulgent amusement, believes she has a hidden talent. And in a remarkable display of confidence, she has insisted on giving us a unique performance for our first dance. She let out a small indulgent laugh, as if sharing a charming but slightly absurd secret with her 300 closest friends. The words landed with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a gasp that went through the crowd, but a ripple. A low, confused murmur spread from table to table. Puzzled glances were exchanged. Eyebrows were raised. A few of Serafina's bridesmaids, in on the cruel joke, covered their mouths to stifle their giggles. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it was impossible to refute. She had painted Clara not as a victim, but as an arrogant, attention-seeking servant. Then came the slow, collective turn of 300 heads. Like a tide pulling away from the shore, the focus of the entire room shifted from the radiant bride to the shadowed corner by the kitchen entrance. Clara was frozen. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin cold and clammy. The air turned to glass in her lungs. She could feel every single pair of eyes on her, some pitying, some contemptuous, some cruelly curious. She was a zoo animal, an oddity put on display. Her simple black uniform, stretched taut over her pregnant belly, suddenly felt like a costume of shame. She was a stark silhouette of reality in a room of fantasy, and they were all staring. Her first instinct was to flee. She took a single desperate step backward, her hand reaching for the swinging door that led to the blessed anonymity of the kitchen. But her path was blocked. Two broad-shouldered men in dark suits, members of the event security team, had moved with silent, professional speed, positioning themselves on either side of the doorway. They didn't touch her. They didn't have to. Their presence was an impassable human wall. There was no escape. This is it. The ultimate act of public shaming. Serafina is a true villain. If you believe that trying to humiliate someone like this is one of the worst things a person can do, hit subscribe right now. Only trolls and haters would want to see Clara fail. As if on cue, a single brilliant beam of light snapped on from a fixture on the ceiling. The spotlight operator, following the bride's lead, found Clara and pinned her in its harsh, white glare. It bleached the world to white, erasing the glittering guests and the opulent ballroom, leaving only her, exposed and utterly alone. She was trapped, breathless, and profoundly humiliated, standing on the precipice of a nightmare as the entire world held its breath, waiting for her to crumble. Comment, I stand with Clara, if you're hoping she finds the strength to fight back. The world narrowed to a single, blinding tunnel of light. In the suffocating silence that followed Serafina's announcement, all Clara could hear was the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart. The air was thick with the unvoiced thoughts of 300 strangers. The cruel curiosity, the condescending pity, the bored amusement. She was a curiosity, a piece of dinner theater. The pregnant maid who got too big for her britches. Serafina's lie had been a masterstroke, painting her as an arrogant fool rather than a cornered victim. Every second she stood frozen by the kitchen door, pinned like an insect in the spotlight's glare, solidified that narrative. Her gaze flickered across the ballroom, a desperate search for an anchor in the churning sea of faces. She saw Serafina standing near the dance floor, bathed in a triumphant glow, her smile a perfect, venomous curve. Then her eyes found Julian. He wasn't smiling. His face was a mask of bewilderment, a deep furrow between his brows. He looked from his radiant, smiling bride to the pale, terrified maid, and a flicker of something, doubt, concern, a dawning unease, crossed his features. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew instinctively that it was wrong. But it wasn't Julian who saved her. In that moment of absolute exposure, her mind recoiled from the present and sought refuge in the past. She thought of Leo, of his unshakable belief in her voice, in their future. She thought of the baby beneath her heart, the last living piece of their love, a tiny soul who deserved a mother who fought back, not one who crumbled. And she thought of Eleanor, of how this sacred, private act of singing, her last connection to Leo, had been a source of peace for a lost mind. Serafina wasn't just trying to humiliate her. She was trying to steal that too. to twist it, tarnish it, and turn it into a weapon against her. And in the deepest, most silent part of her soul, something snapped. A fire, born not of rage but of a profound, unyielding love for what had been lost, ignited within her. It burned away the fear, the shame, the resignation. Her spine straightened. Her chin lifted. She was done being a ghost in this house. If they wanted a performance, she would give them one. But it would be on her terms. She began to walk. It was not a walk of shame. Each step was deliberate, measured. The rustle of her simple uniform was the only sound in the cavernous room. The crowd, expecting a tearful retreat or a fumbling, awkward shuffle, watched in confused silence. She bypassed the center of the dance floor and walked directly toward the low stage where the bewildered band members were watching the bizarre drama unfold. As she reached the steps, the wedding planner, Aubrey, rushed forward, holding a microphone like a lifeline. "The lyrics. Did you want to stand for the lyrics?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of pity and professional panic. Clara took the microphone, her hand steady. She reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out the folded sheet music, the vocal Everest, the gilded trap. She held it for a beat, letting the light catch the impossible cascade of notes. Then, in a single, decisive gesture, she let it fall. It fluttered to the stage floor, a white flag of surrender that was, in fact, a declaration of war. She turned to the band leader, a man twice her age with a kind, confused face. "Just a simple rhythm," she said, her voice low but carrying an authority that surprised even herself. 4/4 time. In A minor. Very slow. Just follow my lead." He nodded, a flicker of professional respect in his eyes, and relayed the instructions to his musicians. Clara turned to face the audience. The sea of faces stared back, their expressions having shifted from cruel anticipation to utter bewilderment. She took a deep, steadying breath, the microphone cool against her lips. "This is a song I wrote," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the silence. "It's called Leo's Lament." A soft, mournful chord from the piano rippled through the room, followed by the gentle heartbeat rhythm of the drum. And then she sang. Her voice, when it came, was not the polished, perfect sound of an entertainer. It was something far more potent. It was a whisper of raw, unvarnished truth, trembling with the weight of unshed tears but underpinned by a core of unbreakable steel. Streetlights paint silver on a rain-slicked road. A promise was broken, a story untold. Left here to carry this beautiful load, a half-written lullaby, a seed that you sowed. The room held its breath. The whispers died. The clinking of glasses ceased. Waiters, trays balanced on their palms, froze in place. The song was a confession, a eulogy, a love letter. It was the story of her life for the past 5 months, laid bare for them all to see. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, weaving through the simple chords with an aching grace. As she moved into the chorus, her voice began to swell, gaining power and resonance, filling every corner of the vast ballroom. "And I will rise from the ashes of this sorrow, find a new sunrise in a brave tomorrow, and in her heartbeat, a rhythm I can borrow to finish the song you started for me." The transformation was absolute. The smirks on the faces of Serafina's bridesmaids had vanished, replaced by slack-jawed disbelief. Guests who had been ready to laugh were now leaning forward, captivated, some with tears welling in their eyes. The song was a bridge, connecting her specific private grief to the universal human experiences of love, loss, and survival. Julian stood as if turned to stone. He was not just watching a performance, he was receiving a revelation. This was the voice that calmed his grandmother. This was the source of the profound, quiet sadness he'd seen in Clara's eyes but had never understood. He was hearing the truth of the woman who had been living silently under his roof, a woman of extraordinary strength and heartbreaking sorrow. His gaze shifted to Serafina. Her radiant smile had curdled into a mask of ugly, disbelieving fury. In that instant, the gilded cage of his life shattered, and he saw his bride for the monster she truly was. The song built to a breathtaking crescendo, Clara's voice soaring to a final, powerful note of catharsis and hope. She held it, a beacon of pure, heartbreaking beauty, letting it hang in the air until it faded into a perfect, profound silence. For 3 long, suspended seconds the entire room was still. The silence was not empty, it was filled with the lingering echo of her soul. Then, from a table in the back, a single person rose to their feet, clapping. Another followed and another. And then the room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar. A deafening, visceral, and utterly genuine ovation that washed over her in a tidal wave of validation. The entire room was on its feet, their judgment transformed into awe. Clara stood alone in the spotlight, tears finally streaming down her face, not of shame, not of fear, but of a profound, cleansing release. She had not been executed. She had been resurrected. The applause was a tidal wave, a force of nature that washed over Clara, cleansing her of the shame and fear that had clung to her for weeks. It was more than approval, it was acceptance. For the first time since Leo's death, she felt a flicker of the woman she used to be, the singer, the dreamer, the artist. Tears streamed down her face, blurring the sea of standing figures into a galaxy of shimmering lights. In that moment she was not the maid. She was the music. But the moment was fragile, a soap bubble of triumph floating in a room with a predator. Before the last echoes of the ovation had faded, a figure in white stormed through the crowd, moving with the furious energy of a thwarted tyrant. Serafina mounted the stage, her exquisite gown trailing behind her like the wake of a shark. She snatched the microphone from the stand, her knuckles white. The applause sputtered and died as a new, more sinister tension seized the room. Serafina's smile was a terrifying rictus, a baring of teeth that held no warmth. She leaned into the microphone, her voice a venomous whisper amplified to a roar. "Wasn't that touching?" she said, her tone dripping with a condescension so thick it was suffocating. A truly heartfelt little performance. She turned her head, her eyes locking onto Clara with undisguised hatred. "Now back to the scullery where you belong." The words were a public branding, a vicious attempt to shove Clara back into the box of servitude. The cruelty was so blatant, so unnecessary, that a wave of uncomfortable murmurs spread through the guests. Humiliated anew and utterly overwhelmed, Clara's only thought was to escape. She turned to leave the stage, her vision blurred by tears, her mind a chaotic whirl. She didn't see the thick black power cable snaking across the floor, left there by the band. Her foot caught. Her balance, already precarious with the weight of her pregnancy, was gone in an instant. There was no time to react. She went down hard, a strangled cry of pain and terror ripped from her throat as she landed on her side. Her arms instinctively flew to cradle her belly, a desperate, protective shield for the precious life within. The room erupted in a collective, horrified gasp. The last vestiges of celebration vanished, replaced by a sudden, sickening dread. Julian moved as if fired from a cannon. He shoved past a stunned guest, vaulted onto the stage in 2 long strides, and fell to his knees beside Clara. All pretense of the calm, detached mogul was gone, replaced by raw, primal fear. His face was a mask of terror. "Clara, are you okay?" he yelled, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, afraid not to. "The baby? Is the baby okay?" From across the stage, Serafina's voice shrieked, high and shrill with indignation. "Julian, what are you doing? This is our wedding. Get up. The staff can handle her." Her callousness was a physical blow, a sound so ugly and selfish it seemed to suck the air out of the room. The word, her, delivered with such dismissive contempt for the pregnant woman lying on the floor, exposed the rot at the core of her character. It was undeniable. Julian slowly looked up from Clara, his expression shifting from frantic concern to a cold, dawning fury. He rose to his feet, his movements stiff, his eyes locking onto his new wife. He was about to speak, to unleash the torrent of revulsion building inside him, when another voice cut through the tension. "Wait." The voice was calm, steady, and amplified by the quiet dread of the room. Heads turned. Matteo, the chef, stepped out from the shadows by the kitchen entrance, his white uniform a stark contrast to the darkness. He was holding up his phone, the screen glowing. "I think everyone should hear this," he said, his voice ringing with quiet conviction. He tapped the screen. A tinny but crystal clear recording filled the ballroom. It was Serafina's voice, bubbly and conspiratorial. "I can't wait to watch the pathetic, pregnant little nobody crash and burn," the recording chirped. The cruel, high-pitched laughter of her bridesmaids followed. "It will be the highlight of my wedding. She'll be so humiliated she'll beg to go back to scrubbing toilets." A wave of shocked gasps swept through the guests. People exchanged horrified glances. The shameless, premeditated cruelty of the plot was laid bare for everyone to hear. Serafina's face, already flushed with anger, drained of all color, leaving behind a pasty, waxen mask of pure horror. She looked from the phone to Julian, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. The truth is out. Matteo is the hero we needed. If you believe that karma is real and Serafina got exactly what she deserved, smash that like button. Julian's face was terrifying in its stillness. All the fury had vanished, replaced by an expression of utter, profound revulsion. He looked at the woman he had married less than 2 hours ago as if seeing a complete stranger, a monster he had somehow failed to recognize. Without a word, he looked down at his left hand. Slowly, deliberately, he gripped the brand-new platinum wedding band. Under the glare of the stage lights, he twisted it, pulling the unfamiliar weight from his finger. He held it up for a beat, the simple, elegant ring now a symbol of a grotesque lie. Then he opened his hand and let it fall. It hit the polished stage floor with a small, sharp clatter that echoed through the dead silence of the room like a gunshot. He looked directly into Serafina's terrified eyes, his voice low, steady, and as cold as the grave. "This marriage," he said, each word a final, irrevocable judgment, "is over." The chaos of the wedding dissolved as swiftly as it had erupted, replaced by the quiet, efficient hum of Julian Thorne's damage control. The paramedics who arrived found Clara shaken but, miraculously, unharmed. The fall had triggered a terrifying bout of contractions, but the doctors at a private clinic confirmed that both she and the baby were safe. While Clara rested, Julian's lawyers descended, and his marriage to Serafina Dubois was annulled with a speed that only immense wealth and righteous fury could buy. She was excised from his life like a tumor, a ghost of a memory before the week was out. Julian, humbled and profoundly ashamed of his willful blindness, moved Clara from the sterile maid's quarters into the sun-drenched guest house on his estate. It was a beautiful, private bungalow surrounded by jasmine and bougainvillea, a sanctuary where she could heal. He was no longer her employer. He had become her tentative, guilt-ridden guardian. This new dynamic was awkward, defined by his quiet, constant presence and her hesitant acceptance of his help. He seemed driven by a deep need to atone, not just for Serafina's cruelty, but for his own failure to see it. 2 weeks later, he sat across from her in the sunlit living room of the guest house. "I made a call," he said, his tone careful. "A friend of mine, a producer named Silas Croft. He runs one of the biggest independent labels in the city. He heard the recording from the wedding. A guest posted it online. He wants to meet you." The meeting was a whirlwind. Silas, a man with a sharp eye for authentic talent, saw past the sensational backstory and heard the raw, undeniable power in Clara's voice. A week later, she was in a state-of-the-art recording studio in Santa Monica, a pair of headphones cradling her ears. She sang her heart out, pouring every ounce of her grief, her fear, and her newfound strength into the microphone. They retitled the song Rise from the Ashes, and when it was released, it didn't just make a splash, it was a tidal wave. It became the anthem for anyone who had ever been underestimated, a viral sensation that climbed the charts on the sheer force of its emotional honesty. Amid this dizzying ascent, Clara gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl with a dusting of her father's dark hair. She named her Rose. The months that followed were a surreal blur of sleepless nights and soaring streams, of learning the rhythms of a newborn while fielding calls from her new manager. Julian was a constant, supportive presence through it all. He wasn't a suitor, he was a friend and anchor. He'd show up with groceries, assemble a complicated baby swing with the same focus he applied to coding, or simply hold Rose for an hour so Clara could take a shower. Their relationship evolved, slowly and carefully, from the ashes of that disastrous night into a deep, unspoken friendship built on a foundation of mutual respect. The sterile, white quiet of the hospital waiting room was a universe away from the gilded chaos of the wedding. Julian Thorne sat on the edge of an uncomfortable vinyl chair, his ridiculously expensive tuxedo now a rumpled costume of his own failure. He hadn't loosened his bow tie. He hadn't slept. 4 hours he had ignored the incessant buzzing of his phone, calls from his parents, his lawyers, the caterers, and focused solely on the closed double doors at the end of the corridor. His mind replayed the events in a sickening loop, the triumphant cruelty on Serafina's face, the raw, heartbreaking beauty of Clara's song, and the horrifying thud of her body hitting the stage. Guilt was a physical weight, a crushing stone in his chest. He hadn't just been blind. He had been an accomplice through his ignorance. Finally, a doctor with tired eyes emerged. Julian was on his feet in an instant, his heart hammering against his ribs. Is she? Mother and baby are stable, the doctor said, her voice calm and professional. The fall and the stress of the event triggered preterm contractions, but we've managed to stop them. There are no signs of placental abruption. We want to monitor her for at least 24 hours, but the immediate danger has passed. The relief that washed over Julian was so profound his knees nearly buckled. He braced himself against the wall, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He had come so terrifyingly close to being responsible for an unimaginable tragedy. When he was finally allowed to see her, he found Clara lying in a dimly lit room, an electronic monitor strapped to her belly, filling the silence with the steady, rhythmic whoosh-whoosh of her baby's heartbeat. She looked small and exhausted, her face pale against the white pillowcase. Her eyes were open, but she seemed to be looking at something 1,000 miles away. "Clara," he said softly, stopping just inside the doorway. Her gaze shifted to him, and her expression was unreadable. Not angry, not grateful. Just wary. "Mr. Thorne." The formality of his name was a fresh wound. "Serafina is gone," he said, the words blunt and inadequate. "My lawyers are handling it. The marriage has been annulled." She just nodded, her eyes drifting back to the window. The silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid. He was her employer, the man whose fiancé had tried to destroy her. What was he now? The next day he personally drove her back to the estate, bypassing the imposing facade of the main house and pulling up to a charming, secluded bungalow nestled behind a screen of jasmine and bougainvillea. "This is the guest house," he explained, his voice sounding hollow in the quiet of the car. "It's private. You'll be safe here. No one will bother you." He carried her single suitcase inside. The space was sun-drenched and peaceful, with comfortable furniture and large windows that looked out onto a private garden. It was a sanctuary, not a cage. He had instructed Mateo to stock the kitchen with her favorite foods, a small, clumsy gesture of atonement. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice still distant. "Julian," he corrected her gently. "Please." The days that followed were defined by this awkward, careful dance. He would check on her, bringing groceries or books, but always kept a respectful distance. He was no longer her boss, but he wasn't anything else. He was a man trying to repair a world he had helped to break, and she was a woman cautiously learning if she could ever trust again. About a week later, he found her sitting in the garden, her laptop open. A shaky phone camera video was playing, her performance at the wedding. A guest had posted it online. "It has over 1 million views," Julian said quietly, coming to stand beside her. Clara flinched and closed the laptop. "I look terrified." "They don't see terror, Clara," he said, his voice soft but certain. "They hear truth." He took a breath. That video found its way to a man named Silas Croft. He's a music producer. The real deal. He doesn't chase trends. He builds careers on authenticity. He wants to meet you. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and suspicion. "Why are you doing this?" It was the question that hung between them, the one he had been asking himself. "This isn't a favor, Clara," he said, meeting her gaze directly. "And it's not charity. Serafina tried to use your gift to humiliate you. I think it's time you used it to build your own life, far away from all of this." He paused. "Silas is an opportunity. A business introduction. What you do with it is entirely up to you." He was offering her a door, not a handout. He was giving her agency, the one thing Serafina had tried so desperately to strip from her. Clara looked away, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. Her dream of a music career had died with Leo. To even consider it again felt like a betrayal. But then she placed a hand on her belly, on the steady, rhythmic life within. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Rose. About building a future for her daughter that was defined by strength, not sorrow. She turned back to Julian, her expression still hesitant, but with a new light flickering in her eyes. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll meet with him." Her trust was a fragile, shattered thing, but in the quiet of the sun-drenched garden, she felt the first tentative glimmer of hope begin to piece it back together. The recording studio was another world, a hushed, climate-controlled cavern of dark wood, acoustic panels, and intimidatingly complex soundboards. It was a place built for professionals, for artists who belonged. Clara, in her third trimester maternity jeans and a simple t-shirt, felt like an imposter. Silas Croft, the producer, was a man of quiet intensity. He wasn't unkind, but his focus was absolute. He didn't care about her backstory. He cared about capturing the lightning he'd heard in that shaky wedding video. "Just sing it like you did then, Clara," he'd say from behind the glass, his voice a disembodied sound in her headphones. "Don't think about it. Just feel it." But it wasn't that simple. At the wedding, her voice had been an act of spontaneous combustion, a desperate, fiery release. Here, under the sterile scrutiny of the studio microphone, it felt hesitant and thin. The song, her most private and painful creation, felt alien under the pressure to be perfect. Each failed take was an emotional excavation, forcing her to dig back into the raw wound of Leo's death, only to come up empty. The exhaustion was bone deep. Her back throbbed with a dull, constant ache, and the baby would often choose the middle of a delicate verse to practice a series of sharp, insistent kicks against her ribs. Julian was a silent, unobtrusive presence during those sessions. He never came into the control room to offer an opinion. Instead, he would appear quietly at the door during a break, holding a flask of the ginger tea Matteo had recommended for her fatigue, or a specially designed cushion to support her back in the vocal booth. He wasn't managing her. He was simply making it possible for her to continue. His quiet, practical support was a steadying anchor in the turbulent waters of her self-doubt, a silent apology that was more meaningful than any words he could have spoken. The breakthrough came on the final day. She was on the verge of tears, convinced she couldn't do it. Silas's voice came through her headphones, softer this time. "Forget I'm here. Forget the mic," he said. "Just close your eyes and tell the story. Who are you singing it to?" Clara closed her eyes. The studio, Silas, Julian, it all faded away. She placed one hand on the curve of her belly, and in her mind, she was back in her tiny Nashville apartment, the scent of rain on the asphalt outside. She wasn't singing for a record. She was singing for Leo. And she was singing for the little girl who would only ever know him through this melody. She sang the song from beginning to end, one single, unbroken take. Her voice was not perfect. It was raw, cracked with emotion, and utterly, devastatingly real. When she finished, the silence in the studio was absolute. She opened her eyes to see Silas behind the glass, not looking at his equipment, but at her, his expression one of profound respect. "That's it," he said quietly. "We've got it." 2 weeks later, the sterile quiet of the studio was replaced by the stark, echoing quiet of a hospital room. Rose was born just after dawn, a tiny, perfect miracle with a full head of dark hair and her father's soulful eyes. The moment she was placed on Clara's chest, a wave of love so fierce and overwhelming washed over her that it left her breathless. It was a joy purer than any she had ever known. But in the lonely hours that followed, as she sat in the dark trying to soothe her crying child, the joy was intertwined with a new, terrifying weight. She was a mother. She was solely and completely responsible for this fragile, precious life. The guest house, once a sanctuary, became a chaotic bubble of new motherhood. The world outside ceased to exist. Her life became a relentless 2-hour cycle of feeding, burping, changing, and rocking. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. The glamour of the recording studio, the thrill of creating music, felt like a scene from someone else's life. She was just Clara, a new mother with sore nipples and spit up on her shoulder, trying to remember if she'd eaten that day. Silas called on a Tuesday. "Big day," he announced cheerfully. "Rise from the ashes drops at noon." Clara barely heard him. Rose had a fever, and she was frantically trying to get a hold of the pediatrician's after-hours line. The release of her song was a distant, unimportant event in a world that had shrunk to the 4 walls of her daughter's nursery. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and worry. On Friday evening, she was trying to bounce a colicky Rose to sleep, tears of her own frustration welling in her eyes, feeling utterly defeated. The house was a mess, she hadn't showered, and she was convinced she was failing at the one job that truly mattered. Across the room, her phone, which she'd left on the kitchen counter, began to buzz. A single text message. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. It didn't stop. It began to vibrate with a frantic, relentless energy, skittering across the granite countertop like a living thing. The screen lit up with an endless, cascading scroll of notifications. Missed calls from Silas, texts from a manager she'd barely spoken to. hundreds of social media alerts. She stared at it, bewildered, as the insistent, vibrating hum cut through the quiet desperation of the room. Outside her isolated bubble of motherhood, a storm was gathering. The world was discovering her song, and her life was about to be turned upside down, whether she was ready for it or not. The success of Rise from the Ashes was less a gentle wave and more a flash flood. Clara's voice, suddenly ubiquitous, poured from car radios on the 405, echoed from coffee shops in Silver Lake, and provided the soulful soundtrack to 1,000 viral videos. Her story was everywhere, a sensationalized but compelling narrative spun by entertainment blogs and morning talk shows, the Bel Air ballad, from maid to music royalty. She was the Cinderella story of the moment, a role she found both bewildering and deeply uncomfortable. The fame was an abstraction, a distant echo. The reality was far more tangible, a single, official-looking envelope that arrived by courier. Inside was a check with more zeros than she had ever seen in one place. It wasn't just money, it was freedom. It was the key to a door she thought had been locked forever. The first thing she did was buy a house. Not a palace in Bel Air, but a charming 2-bedroom bungalow in Studio City, with old hardwood floors that creaked with character and a small, sun-drenched yard perfect for a child's swing set. It was hers. The act of signing the deed, of holding the keys in her own hand, was a profound declaration of independence. Julian was there on moving day not as a mogul but as a friend. Dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, his sleeves rolled up, he directed the movers with a quiet efficiency, his presence a steadying, reassuring force. The awkwardness that had defined their relationship in the guest house had slowly melted away, replaced by an easy, comfortable friendship. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and she had seen him stripped of his corporate armor, his guilt and kindness laid bare. Later that afternoon, as Clara unpacked a box of baby clothes, she looked into the nursery to see Julian standing over the half-assembled crib, a set of instructions in one hand and a tiny Allen key in the other, a look of intense concentration on his face. Rose was cooing in her bassinet nearby. He looked up, caught her watching, and offered a small, self-deprecating smile. "I think this is more complicated than my company's last software launch," he admitted. He went over and picked up Rose, holding her with a gentleness that made Clara's heart ache. The baby's tiny hand curled around his index finger, and in that moment, Clara saw him not as Julian Thorne, the tech billionaire, but as a man of profound, quiet decency. For the first time since Leo's death, she felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest finally begin to loosen. She had a home. Her daughter was safe. She had a friend she could count on. She was secure. It was this feeling of peace that made the knock on the door so jarring. It came on a golden Tuesday afternoon, a week after she'd moved in. Rose was napping, and the house was filled with a sleepy, sunlit quiet. Clara opened the front door, expecting a package delivery, and her world tilted on its axis. Standing on her porch was a man with a ghost's face. He had Leo's deep-set, soulful eyes, the ones that had always held a hint of a sad smile. He had the same dark, unruly hair that fell over his forehead in the same way. The resemblance was so shocking, so complete that it felt like a punch to the gut. It was a cruel trick of the light, a waking nightmare. He saw the color drain from her face, and his lips curved into a smile that was all wrong. It was practiced, smooth, and it didn't touch the cold calculation in his eyes. "Clara Vance?" he asked, his voice a polished imitation of the warmth she remembered. "I'm Liam. Leo's brother." Clara couldn't speak. She could only stare, her mind reeling. Leo had mentioned his estranged older brother, a drifter who only ever called when he needed money. They hadn't spoken in 5 years. Liam's gaze slid past her, taking in the freshly painted walls, the new furniture, the tangible evidence of her success. His eyes gleamed. "I saw your story on the news. The song, it's beautiful. Leo always said you were destined for something great." The lie was so smooth, so effortless, it was almost believable. "He told me everything about you, how much he loved you." He leaned against the doorframe, projecting an air of casual, familial concern. "Look, I know we weren't close at the end, but when I heard what happened, and now with all of this," he gestured vaguely at her new life, "I think he would have wanted me to be here, to help look after you and his legacy." He said the word legacy while looking directly at the closed door of Rose's nursery. It wasn't a gesture of love or remembrance. It was a claim. a stake being driven into the heart of everything she had built. He wasn't there to honor a memory, he was there to cash in on a hit record. The sanctuary she had just built had been breached, and the ghost at her door had the face of the man she loved, but the eyes of a vulture. The peace was a fragile, fleeting thing. Liam's campaign of psychological warfare began subtly, a series of calls from a number blocked by a wall of anonymity. Clara would answer, and his voice, a chilling echo of Leo's, would pour through the speaker, smooth and laced with a false, cloying sympathy. "Just checking in, Clara. Making sure you're okay." All this sudden fame, it can be a lot for a vulnerable new mother to handle alone. Each call was a careful, calculated violation, an attempt to plant a seed of doubt in her own stability. When she told him firmly to stop calling, the calls only increased. Then he escalated. One afternoon, while she was in the yard gently pushing Rose in her new swing, she looked up and saw him standing on the sidewalk, just beyond her property line. He wasn't doing anything, just watching, a sad, performative smile on his face. It was a chilling assertion of his presence, a message that the walls of her new home were not enough to keep him out. "I just wanted to see my niece," he said, his voice loud enough for a neighbor watering their lawn to hear, when she confronted him at the gate. Leo would have wanted me to be part of her life. He was a master of optics, twisting his greed into a narrative of familial love. The final blow came a week later. A sleazy online tabloid published a blurry photo of him standing outside her house, holding a cheap-looking teddy bear. The headline was a masterpiece of insinuation: "Grieving uncle denied access to hitmaker's tragic love child." The article was filled with anonymous quotes hinting at Clara's fragile emotional state, and concerns that she was being improperly influenced by her wealthy benefactor, Julian Thorne. Clara's initial fear, a cold, sickening dread that made her lock her doors and check them 3 times, began to curdle into something else, a fierce, primal rage. This wasn't just about money. Liam was desecrating Leo's memory, using it as a crowbar to pry his way into her life. He was a threat not just to her career, but to the peaceful, safe world she was desperately trying to build for her daughter. The maternal instinct that had been a gentle hum inside her now roared to life. She was no longer just a victim, she was a protector. She called Julian, her voice not shaky with fear but tight with a cold fury. "He's trying to paint me as an unstable mother. He's trying to use Rose." The shift in Julian's response was immediate and profound. The guilt-ridden benefactor vanished, replaced by a focused, formidable partner. His voice on the phone was calm, but with an underlying edge of steel. "He's not going to win, Clara. What do we do next?" The word, "we," was a turning point. The next morning, Julian was at her house, not with groceries, but with Barbara Chin, a family law attorney with a reputation as a shark and a gaze that could cut glass. In Clara's sunlit living room, they spread out the evidence: phone records, a neighbor's security footage of Liam's visits, the tabloid article. For the first time, Clara felt a flicker of power. She was no longer just reacting, she was building a case. Their strategy sessions became a new routine. After Rose was asleep, Julian would come over, and they would sit at her kitchen table until the early hours of the morning, surrounded by legal documents and mugs of strong coffee. The shared purpose forged a new, deeper intimacy between them, one that transcended their complicated history. The kitchen table became their war room, and in the quiet, vulnerable hours of the night, they became a team. One night, while poring over a draft of a cease and desist letter, Clara's exhaustion finally broke through. She buried her face in her hands. "I feel like he's stealing him all over again," she whispered, the words choked with grief. "He's taking the best parts of my memory of Leo and twisting them into something ugly." Julian reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, steady, and achingly gentle. "He's not," he said, his voice low and certain. "Leo is who you remember. He's the song you wrote. This man is just a ghost wearing his face. And we are going to exorcise him." She looked up, and in the soft glow of the kitchen light, the legal battle and the exhaustion faded away. She saw him not as a billionaire or a benefactor, but as a man who saw her strength, not just her pain. He saw a fighter. And he was in the trenches with her. Their eyes met and held, and the air between them shifted, charged with a sudden, unspoken intensity. The professional barrier, the careful friendship, it all dissolved in that one long look. He saw the trust she was finally, completely placing in him. She saw the fierce, protective loyalty in his gaze. He slowly raised his other hand and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his thumb grazing her skin. The simple, fleeting touch was more intimate than any kiss. It was a promise. The spark, long dormant, had finally ignited, a small, warm flame in the heart of the battle. They were no longer just a team fighting a legal case. They were two people bound by a shared crisis, on the verge of discovering what they could build together, once the ghosts were finally laid to rest. The legal letters from Barbara Chen were a brick wall against which Liam's threats repeatedly crumbled. His bluffs about contesting paternity and demanding custody were met with calm, factual counteroffers detailing his long-term abandonment and the substantial child support he would owe, retroactive to Rose's birth. Denied a quick payday and facing actual responsibility, his desperation began to curdle into something reckless. He needed leverage, a public narrative that would force Clara's hand. The ambush was planned for a Thursday morning. Clara was returning from a walk, pushing Rose's stroller up the quiet tree-lined street toward her house. As she approached her driveway, a black SUV that had been parked across the road screeched to a halt beside her. The side door slid open and a man with a long-lens camera jumped out, the flashbulb popping like a miniature firework in the morning sun. Before Clara could react, Liam stepped out from behind a hedge, his expression a theatrical mask of sorrow. In his hand he held a large, fluffy teddy bear. It was a perfectly staged scene. "Clara, please," he began, his voice pitched just loud enough for the camera's microphone to pick it up. "I'm not asking for much. I just want to see my niece. To give her this." He held up the teddy bear, a cheap, pathetic prop in his manipulative drama. It's what Leo would have wanted. The camera's shutter clicked relentlessly, a mechanical insect's hungry sound. Clara froze, her body instinctively shielding the stroller. This was his endgame, to create a public spectacle, to paint her as a cold-hearted gatekeeper denying a grieving uncle his family. But as Liam took a step toward her, another car, a sleek, dark sedan, pulled silently into the driveway, blocking his path. Julian got out of the driver's side, his face calm but his eyes like chips of flint. From the passenger side, Barbara Chen emerged, holding a crisp manila envelope. They had been waiting. They had anticipated this. Liam Miller? Barbara's voice was devoid of emotion, a sharp, clinical instrument. "You are being served." She stepped forward and placed the envelope in his hand. "This is a temporary restraining order, signed by a judge this morning. You are to remain at least 100 yards from Clara Vance and her daughter, Rose Vance, at all times. Any violation will result in your immediate arrest." The photographer's camera never stopped clicking, now capturing a far more interesting story. Liam's smooth facade shattered. His face, once a mask of calculated grief, contorted into an ugly snarl of pure rage. The teddy bear dropped from his limp hand, landing on the manicured lawn with a soft, pathetic thud. "You think you can just buy your way out of this?" he spat, his venom now directed at Julian. "You think your money makes you family? She's my blood. That's Leo's kid in there." "Leo's kid deserves to be protected from a parasite," Julian replied, his voice dangerously quiet. But it was Clara who stepped forward, her fear completely gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable strength that seemed to radiate from her. She pushed the stroller slightly behind her, a lioness shielding her cub. She looked directly at the man who wore her dead lover's face, and her voice when she spoke was not loud, but it cut through the air with the finality of a closing door. "Leo would be ashamed of you," she said. The words were a quiet arrow that found its mark. Liam flinched as if struck. "He would be disgusted that you are using his memory, our memory, to try and extort money. You are not his legacy, Liam. My daughter is, and you will never be a part of her life. Now get off my property." Her command was absolute. Defeated, exposed, and utterly stripped of his leverage, Liam stood there for a moment, his face a canvas of impotent fury. The photographer, sensing the climax, moved in closer, the shutter clicking like a machine gun, capturing every delicious detail of his humiliation. With a final, choked curse, Liam turned and practically fled to his car, his pathetic performance ending in a furious, defeated retreat. That evening, the house was quiet again. The legal documents were filed away. Rose was sleeping peacefully in her crib. The victory, however, was a heavy one. As Clara stood staring out her kitchen window into the darkening yard, The adrenaline that had sustained her finally ebbed away, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. The emotional dam she had so carefully constructed for weeks finally broke. A single hot tear traced a path down her cheek, followed by another and another. They were tears of relief, of grief for the memory Liam had tried to tarnish, and of the sheer, overwhelming weight of it all. Julian came to stand beside her, handing her a glass of wine. He didn't speak, just stood with her in the quiet comfort of the shared silence. "It's finally over," she whispered, her voice thick. She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done this without you, Julian. You would have found a way," he said softly. "You're the strongest person I've ever met." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "But I'm glad I could be here. And Clara, I wasn't just helping a friend fight a legal battle." He took a step closer, the space between them suddenly charged with a new, fragile energy. "Watching you protect Rose, seeing your strength. I wasn't just an ally. I was falling in love with you." The confession hung in the air, simple, honest, and utterly transformative. All the unspoken moments, the shared glances, the quiet support, it all coalesced into this one perfect truth. "I think," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I think I was falling in love with you too." He raised his hand and gently brushed a tear from her cheek, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. The shared crisis, the battle won, the profound relief, it all culminated in this one quiet moment. He leaned in and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of a deep, resonant rightness. It was the feeling of a long-held breath finally being released, of two fractured souls finding a new, more perfect harmony. It was the feeling of coming home. The roar was a physical thing, a deep, resonant beast that vibrated through the concrete walls of the dressing room, but it no longer held any fear for her. It was the sound of a promise fulfilled. 6 months had passed in a whirlwind of success that still felt surreal. The restraining order against Liam was a permanent, forgotten document filed away in a lawyer's office. His ghost finally banished for good. Clara's debut album, Leo's Lament, had gone multi-platinum, its title track a permanent fixture on the airwaves, a testament to the power of a story told with an honest heart. But in the hushed, brightly lit sanctuary of her dressing room, the roar was just a distant hum. The only sound that mattered was the soft, contented sigh of her daughter. Rose, now a beautiful, curious 10-month-old, nursed peacefully in her arms. The chaos of her old life, the cold marble floors, the scent of lemon polish, the weight of Serafina's disdain, was a lifetime away. This was her reality now, the soft, milky scent of her child, the quiet strength of her own home, and the thrumming welcome of a stage waiting for her. The door opened softly and Julian stepped inside. The love between them was no longer a fragile, unspoken thing. It was a quiet, sturdy presence in their lives, built in the quiet moments between recording sessions and late-night feedings. He came over, his eyes shining with a pride that stole her breath, and gently took the sleeping baby from her arms, settling her into the travel bassinet in the corner. He knelt in front of Clara, taking her hands in his. "They're waiting for you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, resonant rightness, a confirmation of the battles they had fought together and the quiet, loving life they had built. Clara stood, her heart a wild, joyful drum against her ribs. She walked through the backstage labyrinth, the roar growing louder with every step, transforming from a hum into a thunderous wave of sound. She was no longer a maid walking toward a trap, no longer a grieving woman navigating an uncertain future. She was an artist, a mother, a partner, walking toward her destiny. An assistant gave her a final nod, and she stepped out from the darkness of the wings into a blinding supernova of light. The spotlight, once a weapon of humiliation, now felt like a warm embrace. The wave of sound from 17,000 people washed over her, and she met it not with fear, but with a radiant, genuine smile. Her eyes scanned the crowd and found the front row. Julian stood there, his face illuminated by the stage glow, a look of absolute love etched onto his features. In his arms, wearing tiny sound-protecting headphones, was Rose, her small form a perfect, precious anchor in the vast sea of strangers. He lifted their daughter slightly as if to say, "Look what your mother built for us." In that instant, every trace of sorrow vanished, replaced by a profound, soaring joy. She stepped up to the microphone, home at last. She had faced down every ghost of her past, built a new family from the ashes of her old life, and was finally, completely ready to sing her own story, not of lament but of triumph. Clara made it. From the depths of despair to the top of the world. Her story is proof that your circumstances don't define you. If you're inspired by Clara's journey, subscribe to this channel for more stories about overcoming the odds. Don't let the Seraphinas of the world win.